In Manhattan's high-stakes financial world, the most dangerous person in the room isn't the billionaire shouting orders. It's the one quietly refilling your water glass. Because when power gets careless, it forgets who's listening. And that mistake can cost everything. For 3 long hours, Preston Calloway treated Sarah Miller like a piece of furniture. He ignored her presence, mocked her intelligence, and casually bragged about questionable corporate moves right in front of her. He assumed she was just a waitress, someone invisible, harmless, and far beneath him. By the time CEO Arthur Sterling finally rose from his chair, a wine glass lay shattered on the floor, a corporate empire was collapsing, and a fortune had vanished into thin air. This is the story of how a single apology changed everything. The air inside the Gilded Oak never changed. It always carried the same heavy blend of truffle oil, polished mahogany, and quiet desperation. This was the kind of restaurant where a Caesar salad cost $35, where the lighting was dim enough to hide a secret affair, yet bright enough to read the fine print of a contract slid across the table. Deals were made here. Reputations were broken here. Sarah Miller stood at the service station, adjusting her apron. Her fingers trembled just slightly, not from nerves about the job. She could carry 4 plates on one arm and recite the wine list backward without missing a beat. What made her uneasy was the name written neatly beside table 4 on the reservation list. Arthur Sterling. Sarah, focus, Gregory hissed beside her. The floor manager wiped an imaginary speck of dust from his lapel, his eyes darting like the building was about to catch fire. Gregory believed panic was a leadership skill. Sterling is the CEO of Sterling Hale. He's bringing his VP, Preston Calloway. This isn't dinner. This is a coronation. Calloway takes over the board next month. Sarah exhaled slowly. I need you invisible, Gregory continued. Edition: no talking. No opinions. No personality. Just water glasses and silence. Understood? Invisible, Sarah replied calmly. I know the drill. She tucked a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear. Fill the glasses. Clear the crumbs. Keep my mouth shut. Gregory checked his watch. They're here. Sarah glanced through the service window just as the heavy oak doors swung open. 2 men entered like the room belonged to them. Arthur Sterling walked with measured dignity. Late 60s. Silver hair. A tired but kind face that carried the weight of a billion-dollar logistics empire. He leaned on a cane with a polished silver handle, favoring one leg slightly. Beside him strode Preston Calloway. Younger. Sharper. Dangerous. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than Sarah's car. His smile was wide but empty, predatory. He laughed loudly at his own joke, briefly checking his reflection in the glass of the hostess stand as they approached the table. Sarah inhaled and lifted the pitcher of ice water. Just do the job, she told herself. Rinse due Tuesday. She approached as they sat. Arthur, I'm telling you, Preston said loudly, his voice cutting through the dining room. The Asian merger is locked. I gutted redundancies in the supply chain. 12% savings in Q3 alone. Sarah stepped in smoothly, beginning to pour. Water, Preston snapped, not looking up. He raised a hand and snapped his fingers. Sparkling. Not tap. And seriously, do you feel this humidity? I'll bring San Pellegrino immediately, sir, Sarah said softly. He didn't acknowledge her. He leaned closer to Arthur, turning his shoulder and effectively blocking her from the table. The old guard is too sentimental, Preston continued. We need lean. Ruthless. Arthur looked up then, really looked at Sarah. His blue eyes met hers, sharp and thoughtful. For just a second, he actually saw her. Still water for me, please, he said kindly. Thank you, miss. Sarah nodded and stepped. D away, a cold knot forming in her stomach. Gutted redundancies. Corporate language for firing people. And she knew Preston Calloway's methods all too well, better than anyone at that table. Because 5 years earlier, Sarah Miller hadn't been wearing an apron. She'd been Sarah Miller, CPA, a junior forensic accountant at the firm that audited Sterling Hale. No one here knew that. To them, she was invisible. "He's 3 scotches deep," Mike the bartender muttered as he handed her the sparkling water. "Came in from the members' club next door. He's looking for a fight." "He's looking for a promotion," Sarah replied quietly, setting the bottle on her tray. "And he doesn't care who he crushes to get it." When she returned to table 4, the mood had shifted. Arthur sat stiffly, uncomfortable. Preston sprawled across the space like a conqueror, his arm sweeping wide enough to knock over the salt shaker. "It's about legacy," Arthur said gently. "My father built this company on trust. On treating drivers and warehouse staff like family." Preston laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Family doesn't move stock prices," he said. "Revenue does. And I'm the revenue." Sarah reached in to pour the sparkling water. "Watch it," Preston snapped. She froze. She hadn't touched him. She was barely inches away. "You're hovering," he sneered, finally turning his glassy, cruel eyes on her. "Can't you see we're talking business? Pour the damn water and get lost." "Preston," Arthur said softly. "She's just doing her job." "She's interrupting," Preston muttered, grabbing his menu. "Ribeye. Rare. If it's medium rare, I'm sending it back and docking the tip." "Very good, sir," Sarah said evenly, though her fingers clenched the tray until it shook. "And for you, Mr. Sterling?" she asked. "Dover sole," Arthur replied. Then he glanced at Preston, and back at Sarah. "And I apologize for the tone. It's been a long day." "Don't apologize to the help," Preston scoffed, scrolling his phone. "Makes them think tea. Harry equals." The word burned. Equals. Sarah felt heat rush to her face as she turned away, the tray trembling in her grip. She wasn't just angry. She was terrified. Because Preston Calloway had no idea who had just heard him speak. She froze the moment she remembered what Preston had said earlier, something about an Asian merger. A casual phrase. Too casual. Because Sarah knew, with absolute certainty, that the Asian merger did not exist. The kitchen behind her erupted in noise, chefs shouting orders, metal pans clanging, steam hissing from open burners. It was a chaotic symphony of heat and motion, a brutal contrast to the dining room's quiet menace. Sarah punched the order into the terminal, her fingers moving on instinct while her mind spiraled. Asian merger. Strategic realignment. Redundancies. 5 years ago, she'd heard language like that before. Back then, Sarah was a CPA. An auditor. And she had uncovered something she wasn't supposed to see, a discrepancy buried inside a subsidiary of a company Preston Calloway had consulted for. Millions of dollars quietly flowing through shell companies in Panama. Clean on paper. Rotten underneath. She'd reported it to her superior. The files vanished. 2 days later, she was fired for gross incompetence and breach of confidentiality. Her name was blacklisted. Her CPA license suspended pending an investigation that never came. No hearing. No appeal. Just silence. Preston Calloway had been behind it. She'd never met him, only his signature at the bottom of a document. A neat, confident flourish. And now, somehow, here he was. Doing it again. "Order up, table 4, the chef barked. Sarah grabbed the plates, forcing her face into neutrality. She had to keep it together. She had to walk back out there and serve the man who had erased her career. When she returned to the table, the air had shifted. "I need your signature tonight, Arthur," Preston was saying now, his voice lowered, sharpened. He slid a blue folder across T. He white tablecloth. "The board meets Monday. If we don't move the liquidity to the new accounts by Friday, the deal collapses." Arthur Sterling hesitated. His knife hovered uselessly over the bread plate. "I haven't had legal review this yet, Preston. You know I don't sign anything without legal. Legal is slow, Preston replied smoothly, pouring himself more wine. And slow costs us the window. Trust me. I've been managing the accounts. It's clean. Sarah set the sole in front of Arthur. As she leaned forward to place the steak in front of Preston, her eye caught something inside the open folder, a logo, half hidden beneath the top page. Vanguard Logistics. Cayman Islands. Her heart slammed to a stop. It was the same structure. The same offshore shell. The same playbook from 5 years ago, copied line for line. This wasn't a merger. He was siphoning Arthur Sterling's liquid assets offshore before the old man retired. Draining the company. Letting it collapse. Blaming market volatility. Thousands of workers, truckers, warehouse staff, office employees would lose everything. Excuse me? Preston snapped. Sarah realized she'd been staring. Are you reading my documents? His voice was suddenly ice. She jumped. No, sir, she lied, her throat dry. Just placing your stake. Then place it and go, Preston said sharply. You're hovering. It's creepy. Preston, that's enough, Arthur said, firmer now. Young lady, could we get another bottle of wine? The Cabernet. Certainly, Mr. Sterling. Sarah retreated to the service station, her pulse hammering. She needed proof. She couldn't accuse him, she was a waitress. Who would listen? But she couldn't let Arthur sign. If he did, pensions would vanish overnight. Lives like hers would be wrecked, quietly, efficiently. She grabbed the leather-bound wine list and flagged Gregory. Greg, she whispered urgently. Table 4. Preston Calloway is drunk and bullying Mr. Sterling into signing something illegal. Gregory's face DRA. End of color. Sarah. Stop. That is none of our business. He's scamming him, she insisted. I used to be an auditor. I recognize the paperwork. Gregory grabbed her arm, fingers digging painfully into her bicep. Listen to me very carefully. You are a server. You serve food. You do not audit customers. If you cause a scene, I will fire you before you hit the floor. Do you hear me? I have a mortgage. Don't ruin this. He shoved her gently back toward the dining room. Go. Pour the wine. Smile. Sarah stood there, clutching the heavy wine list, feeling impossibly small. Don't ruin this. She thought of her studio apartment. The leaky faucet. The student loans. One firing away from nothing. Then she looked back at table 4. Arthur Sterling looked defeated. His shoulders slumped. He was reaching into his jacket pocket for a pen. Preston was grinning, wide and triumphant. A shark sensing blood. Sarah made a choice. She didn't go for the expensive Cabernet. She grabbed the house red. At the bar, she uncorked it. Her hands were steady now, guided by something colder than fear. She poured 2 glasses and walked back. Arthur held the pen. The tip hovered over the signature line. Just right there, Artie, Preston coaxed, using the nickname Arthur clearly hated. Then we celebrate. Sarah reached the table. She placed the first glass in front of Arthur. Then she stepped to Preston's side. She knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't going to spill the wine on him. That would be clumsy. Obvious. She was going to make him do it. She set the glass down deliberately too close to his gesturing hand, just inside the blind spot of his peripheral vision. And once this is done, Preston flung his hand outward for emphasis. Smash. Crystal met knuckle. Red wine didn't spill, it exploded. A dark, blood-colored wave crashed over the blue folder, instantly soaking the pages. Ink bled. Paper sagged. The rust splashed across Preston's cream silk tie and navy lapel. You stupid cow. Preston screamed, leaping up as his chair shrieked across the marble floor. The restaurant went dead silent. Forks froze midair. Every eye locked onto table 4. My suit, my God, the contract. Preston grabbed the sodden folder, shaking it wildly. The ink ran in streaks, the pages dissolving into pulp. Look what you've done. Sarah stepped back, clutching the empty tray to her chest. I'm so sorry, sir, she said softly. You moved your hand so quickly. I moved my hand? Preston roared, his face beet red, a vein bulging in his neck. He lunged toward her, invading her space. You clumsy, incompetent idiot. Do you have any idea what this is? Do you know how much this suit costs? He snatched a cloth napkin. She scrubbed at the document in blind panic, dragging her fingers across the page until the paper began to tear under the pressure. Ink bled everywhere. The contract dissolved into a pulpy, unreadable mess. It was beyond saving. It's ruined, someone muttered. We have to reprint. We'll have to go back to the office. Around the table, voices overlapped in chaos, but Arthur Sterling didn't move. He sat calmly in his chair, cane resting against his leg, eyes drifting from the soggy remains of the contract to Sarah. There was no anger on his face. No outrage. Only curiosity. Get the manager. Preston Calloway suddenly roared, leaping to his feet. His fingers shook inches from Sarah's face. I want her fired. I want her out of this building, now. Gregory was already running. He sprinted across the dining room like a man fleeing a fire, his expression frozen in terror. Mr. Calloway, I am so sorry, he babbled when he returned. Please allow us to cover the cleaning. We'll comp the entire meal. Comp the meal? Preston laughed, sharp and unhinged. I want her head on a platter. She did this on purpose. I saw her eyes. She's malicious. She's fired. Without hesitation, Gregory turned to Sarah. Sarah, get out. Clock out. Go. Now. Wait. The single W. Ord sliced through the noise like a blade. Arthur hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. The authority behind it was absolute. Slowly, deliberately, Arthur pushed himself up using his cane. He leaned over the table, examining the soaked contract. He lifted a fragment of the paper between 2 fingers, watching the ink smear and blur. Mr. Sterling, please, Gregory stammered. We can handle this. Quiet, Arthur said. Then he turned to Sarah. You, he said calmly. Yes, sir, Sarah replied. She didn't step back. She didn't avert her eyes. Arthur studied her. You were very precise when you poured that water earlier, he said. And you've been watching this table closely for over an hour. He paused. My associate claims you did this intentionally. Sarah glanced at Preston, who was furiously rubbing wine off his Rolex, disgust etched into his face. She looked at Gregory, whose eyes silently begged her to leave, now, before it got worse. She inhaled. There was nothing left to lose. I did, Mr. Sterling, she said clearly. A wave of gasps rippled through the dining room. Gregory looked like he might collapse on the spot. You hear that? Preston shouted. She admits it. She's insane. Call the police. Arthur didn't even look at him. Instead, he asked one quiet question. Why? His gaze stayed locked on Sarah. Why would a waitress destroy $1,000 suit and risk her livelihood? Sarah's voice didn't waver. Because if you had signed that document, she said, and something sharper surfaced beneath her tone, you wouldn't have just lost a suit. You would have lost your entire company. The room went still. That document wasn't a merger agreement, she continued. It was a transfer of assets to a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands, Vanguard Logistics. Preston froze. The same shell company, Sarah added, that Mr. Calloway used to launder $3 million during the Tilson Tech bankruptcy 5 years ago. The silence that followed was suffocating. PR. Eston's napkin slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the floor. The color drained from his face so fast it was almost shocking. "What did you say?" he whispered. "I said," Sarah stepped forward, "that the wine was the only way to stop the ink from drying. Because once that signature set, the money would move. And Mr. Calloway knows the forensic trail becomes exponentially harder to follow once funds cross international borders." Arthur turned, slowly, to face his vice president. "Preston," he said evenly. "What is she talking about?" "She's lying," Preston stammered. "She's a waitress. She's crazy." He spun toward Sarah, panic breaking through his rage. "Who are you? Who the hell are you?" "My name is Sarah Miller," she said. "And 5 years ago, I was the lead junior auditor at Deotte." Preston's breath caught. "I was the one who uncovered your Tilson accounts," Sarah continued. "And you were the one who had me fired to bury it." The jazz music drifting through the restaurant suddenly felt grotesquely cheerful. Preston stared at her, really stared. He no longer saw a waitress. He saw a threat. "You're delusional," he scoffed weakly. He turned to Arthur with a forced laugh. "Come on. This is absurd. She's just a disgruntled ex-employee projecting her failures onto me. I barely touched that audit." "You were the lead consultant," Sarah shot back. "You signed off on the liquidation. And you used a signatory named J. Doe for Vanguard's accounts." Preston flinched. "I assumed it was a placeholder," Sarah said, "until I realized J. Doe was listed as the actual beneficiary on the Cayman Incorporation papers." "That's confidential information." Preston snapped. "If you ever work there, which I doubt, you're violating multiple NDAs." "I don't work there anymore," Sarah replied, stepping closer, wine still dripping onto the marble floor. "Because you made sure I couldn't." She gestured to the soaked folder. "But I'm not talking about the past. I'm talking about right now." Her eyes locked onto Preston's. "That contract contains the same routing number. Chase Manhattan, then offshore. Standard Chartered, Hong Kong branch. Account ending in 4490. Preston's jaw dropped, just a fraction. Arthur saw it. "That's a standard routing number," Preston stammered. "Is it?" Arthur asked quietly. He hadn't moved. His grip tightened on the silver handle of his cane. "Because I don't recall us having vendors in the Cayman Islands," Arthur said. "Our logistics hub is in Singapore." "It's a holding company," Preston insisted, sweat beading on his forehead. He wiped it with a wine-stained napkin, leaving a red smear across his skin. "Tax optimization. You pay me to be creative." His voice cracked. "This woman is accusing me of embezzlement based on a glance at a wet document." And Arthur Sterling kept watching him, without blinking. Sarah folded the piece of paper carefully, as if it might cut her fingers if she rushed. "I have an eidetic memory for numbers," she said evenly. It was a lie. Sarah didn't have a photographic memory. What she had was worse. She remembered these numbers, the ones that destroyed her life. She had written them down every night for a year, scribbled on napkins, receipts, the backs of envelopes, replaying them over and over, trying to understand how she had missed what was right in front of her. "And I also know," she continued, her voice steady but sharp, "that tax optimization does not involve moving 40% of a company's liquid assets into a blind trust 48 hours before a board meeting." For a split second, no one moved. Then Preston exploded. "Manager," he screamed, his polished composure finally cracking like cheap glass. "Get this woman out of here. Call the police. She's harassing me. She assaulted me." Gregory, the restaurant manager, had been frozen in place, hovering uselessly near the edge of the confrontation. But Preston's outburst jolted him into motion. He lunged forward and grabbed Sarah's arm. His fingers digging in hard. That is enough, Gregory hissed, his face drained of color, panic leaking into every word. Sarah, you are done. You are trespassing. Come with me to the office now, before I have security drag you out. Let go of me, Sarah said, wincing as his grip tightened. I said move, Gregory snapped, yanking her back. Take your hands off her. The command didn't come from Sarah. It came from Arthur Sterling. Arthur slowly rose from his chair. He was an old man, yes, but he stood with the immovable authority of someone who had built skyscrapers, shipping fleets, and entire industries from nothing. He lifted his cane and pointed it directly at Gregory. If you touch her again, Arthur said, his voice trembling with restrained fury, I will buy this building tomorrow and turn it into a parking lot. Do you understand me? Gregory released Sarah instantly, recoiling as if he'd been burned. Mr. Sterling, I was just trying to protect our guests. You are protecting a thief, Arthur replied flatly. He turned his gaze to Preston. The warmth vanished from the CEO's face, replaced by something cold and unyielding, the stare of a man who had crushed rivals without blinking. Preston, Arthur said quietly, give me your phone. What? Preston laughed, thin and nervous. Arthur, don't be ridiculous. This waitress has gotten into your head. Give me your phone, Arthur repeated, enunciating every word. If this is a legitimate transfer to a vendor, your banking app will show an invoice attached to the routing number. If it's a shell company, it will show a direct wire transfer with no counterparty documentation. Preston clutched his jacket pocket. This is a violation of my privacy. I have personal photos on there. Other client data. We are talking about company funds, Arthur interrupted, extending his hand. That phone is company property. Hand it over, or you are fired for cause effective immediately, and I will have the forensic team at TH. E office by 6 a.m. The dining room went silent. A couple at a nearby table stopped eating entirely. The woman lifted her phone and began recording without shame. Preston glanced at the door. Then at Arthur. Then at Sarah. For a brief moment, Sarah thought he might bolt. He had the wild, calculating look of a trapped animal, eyes flicking to the exit, measuring distance and odds. But Preston Calloway was a man fueled by ego. Running would mean guilt. And Preston believed, truly believed, that he was smarter than everyone else in the room. Slowly, he pulled out his phone. His thumb shook as he unlocked it with his fingerprint. Fine, he spat. Look. Look at the transfer request. It's for Vanguard Logistics Solutions, a supply chain consulting firm I hired to streamline the Asian merger. It's legitimate, Arthur. You're making a mistake. He shoved the phone toward him. Arthur took it, adjusted his glasses, and frowned at the screen. He wasn't tech-savvy, Sarah knew that. He came from the era of dictated emails and paper ledgers. I don't know what I'm looking at, Arthur admitted. Allow me, Sarah said softly. No. Preston shouted. She's not touching my phone. She is the only independent auditor in this room, Arthur said calmly. He handed the phone to Sarah. Miss Miller, is that your name? Yes, sir. Look at the transaction details. Tell me what you see. The phone was warm in her hands, slick from Preston's sweat. The screen displayed the Sterling Hale corporate banking portal. A pending transfer of $12.5 million sat there, waiting for approval. She tapped into the beneficiary details. Well? Preston demanded. It says Vanguard Logistics, doesn't it? It does, Sarah replied, and for half a second, doubt crept in. Had he actually built a legitimate front? Had she finally been wrong? Then she scrolled. She opened the Swift BIC metadata. Sarah smiled, a quiet, sad, vindictive smile. It says Vanguard Logistics, she announced T. Oh, the room. But the beneficiary address isn't a corporate office in Singapore. It's a P.O. box in Georgetown, Grand Cayman. She turned the phone so Arthur could see. And the reference field, she continued, doesn't cite an invoice number. It lists P. Calloway, personal loan repayment. The air drained from the room. Arthur stared at the screen. Read it again. Personal loan repayment. When he looked up at Preston, the betrayal in his eyes was worse than anger. You were paying off your personal debts, Arthur said slowly, with my company's operating capital. Preston's face collapsed. The arrogance vanished, leaving behind a frightened, exposed man. Arthur, listen, he pleaded. It's complicated. I made some bad leverage plays on the futures market. I was going to pay it back. Once the Asian deal closed, my bonus would have covered it. It was temporary. It's embezzlement, Sarah said calmly. And it's a felony. It's not embezzlement if I intended to return it. Preston shouted, his voice cracking. He lunged for the phone. Hey! Mike, the bartender, vaulted clean over the mahogany bar. He was built like a wall, the kind of man who played semi-pro rugby for fun. He planted himself between Sarah and Preston and shoved the executive back with one solid hand to the chest. Back off, Mike growled. Preston stumbled, colliding with a waiter carrying a tray of soup. Bowls shattered across the floor. Hot liquid splashed down Preston's trousers. The man who had entered like a king now stood soaked in wine and soup, exposed, humiliated, and unraveling. Preston stood cornered, surrounded by the very staff he had spent years treating like disposable furniture. His eyes darted from face to face, panic cracking through his arrogance. You're all fired, he screeched, his voice sharp and brittle. Every single one of you. Do you hear me? I'll sue this place into the ground. I'll ruin all of you. The threat hung in the air until it didn't. You won't be suing anyone, Preston. Arthur's voice cut through the chaos. It was calm, but utterly exhausted. In that moment, he sounded a decade older than he had just minutes earlier. The betrayal had settled into his bones. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Preston's breath hitched. Who are you calling? Arthur didn't look at him. Arthur Sterling. The words landed like a verdict. Don't, Preston whispered, suddenly desperate. Arthur, please. We've known each other 15 years. I spent Christmas at your house. I'm the godfather to your grandson. Arthur's jaw tightened. That, he said quietly, is exactly why this is so difficult. He dialed. Hello? Yes, this is Arthur. Get me legal. And then get me the district attorney's office. I don't care what time it is. Wake them up. Preston's face collapsed in on itself. In that instant, he understood, it was over. The unspoken protection he had always relied on, the quiet assumption that men like him were untouchable, had shattered. All because a waitress remembered a detail and took a photo of spilled red wine. He turned slowly toward Sarah. The hatred in his eyes was raw, unfiltered. You, he hissed. You think you're a hero? You're nobody. You're a waitress. You think Arthur Sterling is going to reward you? He sneered. He'll pat you on the head, hand you $100, and tomorrow you'll still be scrubbing tables. Sarah didn't flinch. She lifted her chin. Maybe, he said evenly. But tomorrow you'll be in a cell. And I'll finally be able to sleep at night. I'm leaving, Preston snapped, tugging at his ruined jacket, trying to reclaim control. You can't keep me here. That's kidnapping. Actually, a voice said from the back of the room. Everyone turned. A man stood up from a quiet corner booth, table 9. Gray suit. Unremarkable. A half-finished coffee beside a folded newspaper. He'd been there the entire time, unnoticed. He walked forward and flashed a badge clipped to his belt. Detective Miller, he said, clearing his throat. NYPD Financial Crimes Division. Sarah blinked. Miller? That's my last name. No relation, he said with a gentle smile, then his expression hardened as he looked at Preston. But I have been tracking the Vanguard accounts for 6 months. Preston swayed. We knew money was moving, the detective continued, calm and precise. We just couldn't tie it to a U.S. source. Until tonight. We were waiting for the transfer to initiate so we could capture the IP address. He glanced at the shattered glass and crimson stain. Didn't expect a live confession in a steakhouse, though. Preston looked like he was about to vomit. You were here? We've been watching you for weeks, Mr. Calloway, Miller said, pulling out handcuffs. We just needed the smoking gun. Or in this case, his eyes flicked to the wine glass, the smoking wine. He spun Preston around. Preston Calloway, you are under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and securities fraud. You have the right to remain silent. The restaurant erupted, not with polite applause, but with the collective release of pressure. Guests stood, whispered, pointed. Someone was already live-streaming as Preston was led away in cuffs. Sarah stood frozen, watching as the man who had derailed her life was marched past the hostess stand, past the mirror where he'd admired himself, and out into the flashing lights of a squad car pulling up to the curb. It was over. The adrenaline drained all at once. Her knees buckled. She caught herself on the edge of a table. Easy, Mike the bartender said, gripping her elbow. You okay, Sarah? I think so, she breathed. Slowly, strangely, the restaurant began to normalize. Music grew louder. Servers swept up broken glass. Conversations restarted in hushed tones. But Arthur Sterling hadn't moved. He stared at the empty chair across from him, devastation etched across his face. Sarah hesitated. She should retreat. Hide in the kitchen. Let herself fall apart somewhere cold and quiet. But she couldn't leave him like that. She picked up the only untouched item on the table, the water pitcher. Mr. Sterling, she said softly, can I get you a fresh glass of water, or maybe call someone for you? Arthur looked up. Really looked at her. His eyes were red-rimmed. You saved my company, he said hoarsely. That transfer, if it had gone through, it would have triggered a default. We would have been insolvent by Monday. I just did what was right, Sarah said. You did what was impossible, Arthur corrected. You stood up to a man who held all the power. And you did it with nothing but integrity. He reached into his jacket. For a split second, Sarah braced herself. If he pulled out a bill, she might actually scream. Instead, he placed a heavy, cream-colored business card on the table. Just his name. And a private number. You said you used to be an auditor at Diote. Yes, sir. Until the Tilson incident. And what have you been doing the last 5 years? Sarah exhaled. Surviving. Working double shifts. Paying legal fees from trying to fight the dismissal. Arthur nodded slowly. I have a board meeting Monday, he said. The one Preston was so worried about. I'm going to need a new vice president of finance. But first, I need a chief of internal audit. Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs. Someone who can tear through my books, Arthur continued, and tell me if Preston stole anything else. So, Mion who isn't afraid to spill wine on a suit if the truth demands it. She stared at him. Mr. Sterling, are you serious? I never joke about business, he said, a faint smile finally returning. They said one sentence changed everything. Not a speech. Not a resume. Just a quiet order delivered over broken glass and spilled wine. Be at my office at 8 a.m. tomorrow. Bring your resume. Actually, don't bother. I've seen your work in action. Just bring yourself. Arthur Sterling rose from the table, calmly buttoning his jacket as if the night hadn't just imploded around him. He glanced once at the chaos on the floor, the shattered wine glass, the red stain spreading across the carpet, the contract ripped beyond repair. Then he paused. Sarah? Yes, sir. Put the wine on my tab. And with that, he walked out, leaving behind a ruined deal, a disgraced executive, and a waitress whose life had just been rerouted. Sterling Hale Logistics headquarters towered over the financial district like a steel and glass monument to power. 50 stories tall. Untouchable. Intimidating. At 7:45 a.m., the lobby buzzed with quiet authority. Italian suits swept across marble floors. Heels clicked in perfect rhythm. The air smelled like espresso, polished wood, and money. Sarah Miller stood just outside the revolving doors, smoothing the skirt of her navy blue suit. She'd bought it at a thrift store 3 years earlier, for an interview that never happened. It was clean. Pressed. Respectable. And next to the designer label streaming past her, it felt like borrowed armor. She exhaled slowly. You stared down Preston Calloway, she reminded herself. You can walk through a door. She stepped inside. At the security desk sat Frank, a thick-necked guard who had worked the building for 20 years and looked like nothing surprised him anymore. He glanced at her ID without lifting his head. Visitor pass, he asked. I have a meeting with Mr. Sterling, Sarah said. Frank paused. Then he looked you. Peeved slowly. His eyes moved from her shoes, to her suit, to her face. A smirk tugged at his mouth. Mr. Sterling is the CEO, sweetheart. He doesn't take walk-ins. Courier deliveries go to the loading dock. I'm not a courier, Sarah replied, her voice tightening. I'm the new chief of internal audit. Frank laughed. Dry. Dismissive. Sure. And I'm the King of England. Look, miss, if you don't leave, I'm calling. The phone on his desk buzzed. A red light flashed. The priority line. Frank picked it up. Security. Frank speaking. A pause. Yes, Mr. Sterling. Yes, sir. The color drained from his face. He looked at Sarah again, this time with wide eyes. She is? Another pause. Yes, sir. Immediately. He hung up slowly, stood so fast his chair scraped the floor, and his entire posture changed. My apologies, Miss Miller, he said quickly. Mr. Sterling is expecting you on the 50th floor. I'll unlock the private elevator. Sarah gave him a polite nod. Thank you, Frank. As the elevator shot upward, her ears popped. The city vanished below her. The doors opened to quiet luxury. Plush carpet. Soft lighting. Power without noise. Waiting for her was Arthur Sterling's executive assistant, Mrs. Higgins, a sharp-eyed woman who missed nothing. She handed Sarah a heavy binder. He's in the boardroom, Mrs. Higgins said. The board was called for an emergency session at 8 a.m. They're waiting for you. For me? Sarah asked, her throat suddenly dry. Mr. Sterling said you're the only one who can explain the mess Mr. Calloway left behind, Mrs. Higgins replied. Then, more softly, good luck, dear. You'll need it. The sharks are circling. Sarah walked down the long mahogany corridor. Raised voices echoed behind double doors, argument, anger, fear. She pushed them open. Silence. 12 people sat around a table that cost more than Sarah's childhood home. Titans of industry. Controllers of billions. At the head sat Arthur Sterling. He looked exhausted, but when he saw her, his eyes brightened. Ah, he said, standing. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Sarah Miller. A scoff cut through the room. Simon Hargrave, the chairman of the board, leaned back in his chair and tossed his pen onto the table. Arthur, is this a joke? He said coldly. You fired your VP of finance and had him arrested in a steakhouse based on the word of a server. Arthur didn't flinch. I did a background check this morning. She's been waiting tables at the Gilded Oak for 4 years. She's also a CPA with forensic training. Hargrave snapped. Her license is suspended. She's uninsurable. And you want to give her access to our books? This is negligence. I move we escort her out and hire a reputable firm. Seconded, someone muttered. The room turned. Sarah felt heat rise up her neck. That familiar feeling, the erasure. The reduction. To them, she wasn't a professional. She was a label. Arthur opened his mouth, but Sarah stepped forward first. She placed the heavy binder on the table. Thud. Mr. Hargrave, she said, her voice carrying cleanly across the room. He sneered. I didn't give you the floor. You didn't have to, Sarah replied. Because while you were checking my background this morning, I was checking the board's expense reports from the last fiscal quarter. She opened the binder. They're public filings, but the itemized details aren't. Still, something stood out. Hargrave stiffened. You sit on the audit committee, Sarah continued, yet you approved a $200,000 reimbursement for security consulting to a firm called Blackstone Shield last November. So? Hargrave snapped. Blackstone Shield is a residential security firm, Sarah said, sliding a page across the table. They specialize in high-end vacation homes. Specifically in Aspen, Colorado. The room froze. You own a chalet there, she added quietly. It was renovated in December. Silence fell like a dropped blade. Are you accusing me of something? Hargrave whispered, his face flushing dark. I'm T.E. Lingu Preston Calloway wasn't working alone, Sarah said, turning to the room. He bought silence with perks. He approved personal expenses so no one would question his offshore transfers. She glanced around the table. I found 3 more cases like this. Among board members present, 3 directors suddenly became very interested in the floor. I can fix this, Sarah said steadily. I can untangle what Preston built. I can claw back the assets before the SEC freezes them. I can save this company's reputation. She met their eyes, one by one. But I need full access. Now. She paused. Or you can hire that firm and watch everything burn. 6 months. That's how long the outside firm Mr. Hargrave wanted would need just to learn the systems. 6 months before the federal agents would be escorting everyone out in handcuffs, just like Preston. Sarah let the binder fall shut. So, she said evenly, her voice cutting through the room, am I a waitress, or am I the only person here who actually knows where the bodies are buried? Silence. 10 full seconds passed. Long enough for breaths to feel loud. Long enough for doubt to creep in. Then, clap. Arthur Sterling began applauding. Slow. Measured. One hand striking the other in a deliberate rhythm that echoed off the polished walls. Heads turned. Spines straightened. I believe, Arthur said at last, a small smile tugging at his lips, that the motion to dismiss Miss Miller is denied. He turned slightly. Sarah, take a seat. We have work to do. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel didn't just smell like money. It smelled like old money. White lilies lined the walls. Beeswax polish clung to the marble floors. Somewhere beneath it all lingered the faint, metallic chill of champagne resting in silver buckets. Generations of power had passed through this room, and the air remembered every one of them. 6 months ago, Sarah Miller would have been here, and invisible. A ghost in a black vest and white shirt. Moving silently. Along the edges. Clearing plates. Refilling glasses. Existing only in the peripheral vision of people who never bothered to learn her name. But tonight, the room looked different. Tonight, Sarah stood at its center. Emerald silk draped to the floor, catching the light of the crystal chandeliers with every subtle movement. The gown didn't whisper, it announced. It claimed space. It said, without apology, I belong here. She lifted her glass and took a careful sip of sparkling water. Still no wine. Not after the incident. Her eyes swept the crowd. 500 guests filled the room, tuxedos, couture gowns, polished smiles. Senators. Tech moguls. Executives whose faces she recognized from headlines and quarterly reports. Even the same board members who had tried to fire her on her first day. Now they nodded as they passed. "Good evening, Miss Miller." "Wonderful quarter, Sarah." She returned each greeting with a polite, distant smile. Controlled. Professional. She knew how quickly those smiles could curdle into sneers. She had spent the last 6 months proving it. 16-hour days. Endless nights. Leading the internal audit team through every hidden folder and encrypted transaction. Dragging secrets into the light. Recovering $8 million in embezzled assets. And testifying. Closed deposition. Locked doors. Preston Calloway's high-priced defense attorneys unraveling in real time as the walls closed in. She had earned this dress. "Champagne, Mom." The voice came from her left. Sarah turned automatically, a polite refusal already forming, then stopped. The man holding the silver tray was older. Thinning hair. A face lined with exhaustion that hadn't been there before. He wore the standard white jacket of the catering staff. Gregory. Her old manager from the Gilded Oak. He froze. The tray rattled in his hands, crystal flutes clinking together, threatening to spill. His eyes darted over her, emerald silk, diamond studs, the way guests instinctively gave her space. "Sarah," he whispered, barely audible. His voice cracked. "Hello, Gregory," she replied. Her tone was calm. Steady. Free of the fear that once tightened her chest whenever he shouted orders across a crowded kitchen. Gregory took a half-step back. I didn't know," he stammered. "I heard rumors. Corporate. But a vice president? Is that true?" Sarah steadied him for a moment, then asked quietly, "Are you sorry, Gregory?" The words hit him like a blow. "I am," he blurted out, glancing around nervously. "About that night. Preston was a regular. He spent thousands. I didn't know he was a crook, I was just trying to keep my job. You have to believe me." She remembered his grip on her arm. The way he'd shoved her aside. The way he'd ordered her out while Preston screamed inches from her face. But standing there now, him sweating in a cheap uniform, her wrapped in silk, she felt no rage. Only closure. "I know," she said gently. "You were afraid. Fear makes people do small things." Gregory swallowed. "But don't worry," she continued. "I'm not going to have you fired." The relief hit him all at once. His shoulders sagged as he exhaled the breath he'd been holding for 6 months. "Thank you," he said. You look incredible." "Thank you," Sarah replied. Then, kindly but firmly, "You have tables to serve, Gregory." It was a dismissal. But it was merciful. As he disappeared back into the crowd, Sarah felt the shift settle in her bones. She wasn't the help anymore. She was the power. The lights dimmed. A single spotlight cut through the ballroom, illuminating the stage. Conversation died instantly. 500 people fell silent. Arthur Sterling approached the podium. Slow steps. The cane still there, but he leaned on it less now. His body looked frail, but his eyes were sharp, alive with a clarity that had been missing for years. He adjusted the microphone. A brief whine of feedback. Then silence. "Good evening," Arthur said, surveying the room. "Friends, colleagues, and competitors." A ripple of polite laughter followed. "We're here tonight to celebrate a record-breaking year for Sterling Hale Logistics. Stock prices at an all-time high. Our Asian expansion fully funded and operational. Success, by every conventional measure." Arthur paused, staring down at his hands, the hands that had built an empire. "But metrics," he said softly, "are dangerous things." The room went utterly still. "Metrics told me Preston Calloway was a genius." Metrics told me profit was the only measure of a man. And metrics blinded me. He looked up. His gaze found Sarah. She felt it settle on her, warm, heavy, undeniable. 6 months ago, Arthur continued, I was saved from ruin. Not by a banker. Not by a lawyer. And certainly not by a consultant. He smiled faintly. I was saved by the woman pouring my water. A woman I had ignored for years. Every eye in the room followed his. To Sarah Miller. They judged her for hours without even realizing it. Not because of what she said, but because of what she wore. A uniform has a way of making people invisible. A low murmur rolled through the banquet hall as heads slowly turned, following Arthur's steady gaze until it landed on a woman seated near the edge of the room, wrapped in an emerald dress that caught the light. The energy shifted. People leaned forward. We live in a world, Arthur said, his voice growing stronger with every word, where we mistake status for intelligence. Where we assume the loudest voice in the room must be the smartest. Where we believe the person at the head of the table always knows best. He paused, letting the silence stretch. I learned the hard way that the person clearing the table often sees far more than the one sitting at it. A breath rippled through the crowd. Then Arthur spoke again. Sarah Miller, would you please join me on stage? Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs. This wasn't planned. This wasn't discussed. She was the chief of internal audit, quiet, precise, invisible by design. She was never meant to be part of the show. But refusing wasn't an option. She stood. As she moved forward, the crowd parted instinctively, like water before a ship. Her heels tapped softly against the wooden steps as she climbed toward the stage, every sound magnified in the hush. When she reached the podium, Arthur took her hand, firm, steady. I brought Sarah up here for 2 reasons, he said, facing the stunned audience. First, to offer a public apology. Sarah, I am sorry. For how you were treated. And for the culture I allowed to grow, one that made men like Calloway believe they were untouchable. He bowed his head. A titan of industry, humbled in real time. And second, Arthur continued, lifting his gaze, to talk about the future. The room felt electric. I have led Sterling Hale for 40 years. But it is time for new blood. Time for leadership that notices what others overlook. Leadership that understands the value of every single person in the supply chain, from the warehouse floor to the boardroom. Sarah frowned, confusion tightening her brow. This wasn't right. External candidates were supposed to be interviewed next week. Arthur turned back to the microphone. This morning, I met privately with the board of directors. We voted on my successor. He paused. It was unanimous. The room stopped breathing. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the new Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Hale Logistics, Miss Sarah Miller. For one heartbeat, there was silence. Then the room erupted. Not applause, a roar. The sound of a system being rewritten. Sarah stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, gripping Arthur's hand like an anchor. Her eyes said everything. Are you out of your mind? Arthur winked. You caught a thief with a glass of wine, he whispered. Imagine what you'll do with an entire company. He stepped aside, leaving her alone beneath the lights. Sarah faced the crowd. She saw shock on the faces of her competitors. Awe on the faces of staff lining the walls. And in the back, Gregory, his napkin slipping from his hand, jaw hanging open. She stepped to the microphone. No speech. No teleprompter. Just truth. She placed her hands on the podium, hands that had scrubbed counters, balanced heavy trays, and pored over bank statements at 2 a.m. in a cramped apartment. Thank you, she said. Her voice was calm. Clear. Unshakable. Mr. Sterling is right. I used to be invisible. But when you live in the background long enough, you learn how the machinery really works. You see the cracks. And you see the people holding everything together with nothing but grit and tape. She smiled, not polite, but fierce. Sterling Hale is done being a company for the few. Starting tomorrow, we build for the many. We work hard. We tell the truth. And if anyone believes they can cut corners because they think no one is watching. She let the sentence hang. Her eyes flashed. Remember this. The new CEO sees everything. The applause was deafening. As cameras flashed, Sarah no longer looked like a waitress. She didn't look like an accident. She looked like a queen claiming her throne. And that is how Sarah Miller went from refilling water glasses to running a billion-dollar empire. Because dignity isn't something you wear, it's something you are. And intelligence doesn't care about your uniform. Preston Calloway is now serving 12 years in federal prison for securities fraud. Arthur Sterling is enjoying retirement in Tuscany, knowing his legacy is in the safest hands possible. And Sarah? Her very first rule as CEO was simple. Every executive must spend 1 week each year working in the warehouse or on the customer service line. Because, as she says, you can't lead people if you don't know what it feels like to serve them. If this story inspired you, hit the like button. It helps the channel grow and tells YouTube you want more stories like this. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and don't miss the next tale of justice. Served cold. Now tell me, if you were in Sarah's shoes, would you have spoken up or stayed quiet to protect your job? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.